doing my review for Silver Bullet from 1985. And the reason I watched this was one of my favorite podcasts was reviewing this. They've been reviewing a bunch of Stephen King movies. So I've kind of follow along, watch them, and review the ones that I haven't seen before with them. Show's called Now Playing. And so they did this one in their Stephen King retrospective. And this was 1985. This is like peak Stephen King. That's probably like when he's the most popular. Movie-wise, let's see, Firestarter came out in 1984. Cat's Eye came out the same year, 1985. And then year after, he did Maximum Overdrive, which is like his crazy cocaine-fueled movie, 86. And then Stand By Me, huge movie for him in 86. This is actually one that he did the screenplay for. He didn't always do the screenplay for the movies. This one was one that he did that. And it was actually, so he wrote a novel, or like a novella. Apparently it has a really weird story about that too. It started out as like a calendar. It was supposed to be based on a calendar. And there's like an artist that he worked with that did like all the drawings, and then there's a little bit of story to each of the months. And then he just turned it into something a little bit more. He couldn't do something short and sweet, so he had to write like a whole novel out of it as the story. And it's directed by, a guy named Daniel Attias. Don't recognize him at all. This is the first thing he ever directed, actually. Kind of interesting to have your first thing be a movie. Since then, he's just done a bunch of TV. So, I've been aware of this movie quite a while. I think probably just being on TV a lot and the fact that it is Stephen King, the name gets out there. I just always knew it was werewolf movie. I always thought it was kind of like kid-centric, but it's not. It's rated R. Right away they get into some scenes that are like, yeah, it's not super kid-centric, but I'll get into that. So the movie is centered around a kid named Marty. He's played by Corey Haim. Of course, Corey, one of the two Coreys, Corey Haim was huge in the 80s. I haven't seen too many of his movies. I've only really seen like Lost Boys. But anyways, he's in a wheelchair in this movie. And he has a sister, Jane, and then his crazy Uncle Red is played by Gary Busey. It's always good to see a little bit of Busey in a movie. And they're in this town and start to get some crazy attacks going on. And Marty's convinced that something weird's going on, and then finally sees the werewolf and is convinced that there's a werewolf in town because he's right, but nobody believes him. And then finally he convinces his sister that he was right, and then so the two are kind of together on it, and then they get their Uncle Red, Gary Busey, to help them out and go after this werewolf problem. And so yeah, like I said, Marty's in a wheelchair. That's like a big thing. If you know Silver Bullet, he's in a wheelchair, but then he has like a motorized wheelchair. And then his Uncle Red is the one that makes them. And at the end, he makes it's basically a motorcycle, like a tricycle type motorcycle that he's sitting in. And that allows him to move around pretty quick. Yeah, actually, I watched this quite a while ago now, so my review here is probably not going to be the best thing. But like I said, I was kind of surprised because I thought this was kind of like a kid's movie, just because it's, centered around a kid, a couple kids, I guess. But right away we get like a decapitation. We get into the werewolf attacks right away. Guy's decapitated on the railroad, and like head goes flying. Oop, okay. The violence it's not super graphic, but it's pretty gory. It's kind of in a weird range because it's about kids. I could see this being like for kids, but at the same time it's violent enough where you don't want a kid to see it when they're too young, if that makes any sense. So, but then there's a lot of other kind of themes throughout that are not very kid-centric either, like suicide and some pretty hardcore drinking, especially from Uncle Red as a drunk. And then Like, the 80s is pretty ripe with some good werewolf movies. The pinnacle is, of course, American Werewolf in London. And then The Howling was the same year as American Werewolf. That's really good too. I just watched that not too long ago. And this is, doesn't really compare to the two, especially the effects. So the transformation is not great at all. And just overall, the costume is like pretty generic looking. But overall, even with how kind of clumsy some of the werewolf transformation, the prosthetics, some of the scenes can be kind of goofy with the werewolf and stuff. Even that being said, it's not too bad. It goes along pretty quickly. It's easy to follow. I thought The Howling actually had some of its own problems when I was watching it. I got a little bored at some parts of that. And this one, you don't get really bored. It's not really long enough, and it goes quickly enough where you just kind of go along with it. So it's not a bad movie. I'm gonna give it a 3.25 out of 5. So, you could do worse. I think it's a good example of like an 80s horror film for sure. And I think it'd be pretty good to see if maybe you were like, I'm trying to think, maybe like 12-ish, give or take a year. Because like I said, the violence is a bit extreme for like really young kids. But then it's not like, I think it'd be the most exciting and maybe interesting for somebody that's a bit younger too. So it's kind of, like I said, a weird kind of zone for the movie to be in. On the lower spectrum, for werewolf movies. I'm starting to see my fair share of them now, so it's only a little bit under The Howling, but if you're interested in watching a King movie, Stephen King like 80s movie, it's like the perfect example of that. I think I kind of thought of like Cujo and stuff when I was watching it. Kind of had that same vibe to it. Gary Busey's pretty decent throughout. He brings a little levity to the movie. So yeah, it's a decent recommend. 3.25 out of 5. All right.